Well, hi, my name's David Kowalick.
And I'm Paul Smith.
And we're back together again. So we got the band back together. I've been on holiday and Paul's been sick. So he did a pretty good job of still putting something out there last week, though. So we're probably going to have to edit out a few COVID coughs along the way.
Post-COVID coughs.
Post-COVID coughs. Oh, yeah, post. I'm glad it's post.
Yeah.
Apparently there's an app you can get that you can cough into that tells you whether you got COVID. Did you know that?
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm serious. You cough 5 times and it will tell you if you've got COVID. So,
sounds like a scam.
Yeah, it sounds like a scam. Well, Pfizer bought it, so. Yeah, let's not talk about that anymore. Anyway, we're continuing on with our series about righteousness. And one of the things we really want to talk about is where did this idea of imputed righteousness come from?
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of evangelicals in particular.
Well, we should explain what imputed righteousness is.
Yeah, probably.
Well, no, more specifically, the imputed righteousness of Christ.
Yes.
Because imputed righteousness is what we have, but we don't have Christ's righteousness imputed to us.
Yeah, well, we probably even have to explain what imputed means.
Yeah.
So imputed means something like something that is given or something that is just dropped in on top of you.
Or applied to you.
Yeah, applied to you, something like that.
Well, the thing is, I mean, imputed righteousness can be an accurate translation, right?
Absolutely.
Because, what we're referring to is in Romans 4, where Paul talks about Abraham's faith was imputed to him as righteousness.
Yeah.
Different translations would say credited to him or reckoned to him. Yeah. They're all viable translations of the same term, which all mean kind of, credited to, applied to, reckoned to, and imputed is the term of choice for what? Reformed?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I mean, a lot of translations just had that word imputed, and so it just ended up coming out that way through theology and so on. But the idea of imputed, of course, is it's not a wage, so it's not something you've earned. And, of course, for the Reformed tradition, this whole the grace of God being undeserved merit, that kind of a thing, it kind of matched up with this idea of imputation. But I don't think they're not actually a perfect match in that sense, because just because you haven't earned it doesn't mean that it's been imputed. So the idea of imputation has the idea that there's someone who has the power to give and the other person who doesn't have the power to get, and the only way you can get it is if it's given. It's like praise. Praise is easy to give, but it's really hard to get. In fact, if you try to get praise, it's sort of counterproductive. But if someone praises you, then they've imputed a good opinion to you, which you can't earn. You can't earn good opinion. That has to be given by the other person at their discretion. And so the righteousness that we have been imputed is at the discretion of God.
Yeah.
So, and it's not earned.
And righteousness meaning a status of being righteous.
That's right. So I just imputed you with righteousness.
When you said that's right.
There, that's right.
You didn't. You said you imputed my statement with righteousness.
Oh, okay, yes.
Because you said that's right.
That is right. Yeah.
You would have to say you're right.
Correct. Wow. Splitting hairs. Okay.
This is getting way too technical.
Yeah.
For no good reason.
Yeah. We've already drowned ourselves.
The NIV, which I read up, well, why don't I just read it? So in Romans 4, this is like one of the main passages that's under discussion. Romans 4 from verse 1 says, "What shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." Yeah. So the NIV says credited.
Yes, accredited. That
ascribed, reckoned. Other translations say it was reckoned to him. Mm-hmm. So I think credited is a really good translation or way that we would understand. Mm-hmm. You give someone credit.
Yep.
You say, "Great job."
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah.
You did a really good job of that. You
Yeah.
give them credit.
Yeah.
You're that's what imputation means,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's like someone else ascribing something to someone else.
Yeah.
Now, the issue with all this is that this concept of Abraham being credited with righteousness, and then Abraham being an example for us, being credited with righteousness or imputed with righteousness. What has come about is the idea that the righteousness that gets imputed or credited is actually Christ's righteousness,
Yeah.
an alien righteousness in the language of Luther that comes from somewhere else and gets credited to us.
Yeah.
And we would dispute that
Yes.
as being unbiblical. And in this episode, we're going to have a brief look at some of the historical factors that have led to that, what we would say is quite a distortion of this idea of the imputation or crediting of righteousness.
Yeah. I think it's probably even worth mentioning 2 Corinthians 5 now, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, because this is perhaps the most famous verse concerning this subject, and it's often quoted. It says this, 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And that's often, I've actually heard sermons on this, where it says that Jesus became everything that we are and that he became sinful as us, and then we obtained his righteousness and we become as righteous as Jesus. In fact, we actually have the righteousness of Jesus upon us, and that's how we need to understand it. Of course, we're going to dispute that and say, no, what it's talking about there is that it's the righteousness of God is not the same as the righteousness that's imputed to us. Rather, we become a display of what's good and right about God. So when we have been reconciled through what Christ has done to God, then we show in our lives, in the way that we respond to that, we reveal the faithfulness of God to his own covenant, and that reveals and shows off and glorifies God in his righteousness. So it's not actually talking about our righteousness or a righteousness that's been put on us. It's rather in the justifying and redeeming work of Jesus Christ, God's rightness is revealed in what he's done to us. Something like that would be a better way of understanding righteousness in that particular verse.
Yeah, or I've heard other biblical scholars talk about the idea that we become the righteousness of God, in that the righteousness of God, God's justice and his righteousness are talked about a lot in the Old Testament as his actions.
Yeah.
The actions, God's righteousness is his actions, his righteous activity in the world, in doing right things in the world.
Yeah.
And so when it says that we become the righteousness of God, that the transformed people in the Messiah are a physical embodiment of God's righteous activity in the world.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. It can be taken both ways, yeah.
And that, and when you look at the context of the chapter that where it's talking about, Paul's making a defense of the ministry of the apostles.
Yeah.
That's where that fits in.
Yeah.
Now, way before I ever looked into any of this stuff, I remember in my mid-20s talking to my pastor about this verse because I said to him, what does this mean? And he gave me the typical, the divine exchange, it's often called.
Yeah.
Jesus takes our sin, gives us his righteousness. And without any understanding of any of the issues at play, just on a basic reading of it in the English, I thought, but that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't say we get the righteousness of God.
Yeah.
It says we become the righteousness of God,
Yeah.
which is not at all the same. And yet, this verse is used all the time to say we get the righteousness of God, as if God's righteousness can be transferred to us.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, even just on a plain reading, it doesn't say that.
No.
And there is nothing else anywhere else in Scripture that says that. And if we look at Abraham, what Paul says about Abraham in Romans 4, it doesn't say that Abraham gets God's righteousness or Christ's righteousness applied to him. In fact, it says in verse 9, we have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness.
Yeah.
What was credited to Abraham as righteousness? His faith.
Yeah.
God looked at his faith and said, yeah, that's righteousness.
Yeah. And that's right.
That's the plain reading of the verse.
Yeah.
It's the clearest, and it's in line with all the rest of the scriptural witness about righteousness, what righteousness is.
Yeah.
There is nowhere that you can get clearly the concept of God's righteousness as like some kind of substance, or Christ's righteousness as some kind of substance that can get applied to us, that we...
Yeah, some metaphysical goo that gets poured down on top of you and covers over you and makes you righteous. That's not the concept we have here in the Bible.
No. So where did that idea come from? That's what we're going to talk about this episode.
Yeah.
Which and we're gonna not do it justice because we're talking about thousands of years of a lot of twisting and turning. But we're going to just take a couple of the main things that have really messed up this idea. And the first one is Greek philosophy.
Yeah. So around about the 4th century in particular, Greek philosophy began to enter...
4th century AD?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. 4th century AD.
Well, maybe we should start with what Greek philosophy we're talking about.
Well, we're talking about Platonic philosophy in particular.
Which is in the 4th century BC.
Yeah, but the application of Platonic philosophy through Neoplatonism in particular, we had a resurgence at this time, about 400 years AD, and it particularly had a resurgence within the church because people like Augustine, who was a philosopher in his own right, became a believer, and then he wanted to, because he respected philosophy so much and he loved his faith that he had come into, he wanted to bring the two things together. He actually thought he was doing something beneficial. Up until that time, the whole gospel story was just that. It was a story. It was a narrative about some events that took place in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the effect that had and how that was the fulfillment of all of the old covenant promises. And so it was a story, it was a narrative, and it wasn't a philosophy, it wasn't a kind of a way of thinking. Rather, it was, this is what happened, and this is who has made it happen. And then Greek philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism, began to come through people like Augustine, but not only him, others as well. And by the medieval age, it became just front and center in the church. People like Thomas Aquinas, and even later, in more recent times, people like Calvin also brought a lot of this kind of philosophical understanding to theology. I'm jumping way ahead here, but if we go right back to the Platonic ideals that are in philosophy.
So the fathers of Greek philosophy were Socrates.
Yeah.
Then his student was Plato.
Yeah.
And then his student was Aristotle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the main things they brought to the table, although when I say brought to the table, this ideology was already around, but they just gave it more form, is the idea that everything that is physical is imperfect and that the real things, the ultimate things, are way above us and that they're in the heavens, so to speak. So even this table, for instance, could be thought of as a very dodgy copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the original true tableness which exists somewhere up in the heavens. And so there was this radical dualism between the physical realm and the spiritual realm, and anything to do with the physical body was seen as second class and low. Anything that was really true was spiritual and detached from anything physical, but it was where the original forms of all truth was in the heavens, so to speak, which is one of the reasons why.
Was it in the heavens or just outside of space and time?
Well, even above anything physical. So they didn't see heaven in the way that, say, a Christian would talk about heaven, but rather
it's the realm
the
of the
heavens,
gods,
right up there, and
just
they would
out of our sphere.
Yeah, and in fact, they even had this idea that the stars were representations of demigods and gods, not direct contact. You could never have direct contact with God. You had to go through steps. And so horoscopes are actually about watching the stars, because the gods, which are above everything, are spinning different stratospheres of awesomeness as you go above. And so that one stratosphere touches another one, and there's friction between the two, and that causes movement, which causes movement, which causes movement, and then eventually it affects us. So if you can study what's going on in the stars, you'll be able to predetermine what's going to happen to you here on Earth, which is where this idea comes from. And it has to be mediated to you. Us dust bunnies down here would have holy people who have a higher level of spirituality, and then that goes up to maybe angelic beings or demigods, and then it goes up to lesser gods, and then greater gods, and then to the greatest of all the gods, who is the unmoved mover. It's actually funny. So there are some old Christian hymns which actually have that kind of ideology in them, like what's that hymn that goes, invisible, unmovable, God only wise, or something like that. How's that one go? It's holy, holy, holy. I can't remember it now. Immortal, that's it. Immortal, invisible, God only wise. But the kind of God that's displayed in that hymn is, it's a wonderful hymn, really beautiful music and everything, but it has God as this kind of lonely, unmoved, dispassionate ball of light somewhere up there, who is dispensing things from a long distance. And so, Bette Midler's song, He's Watching Us from a Distance, I think that's how Greek philosophers thought. They thought of God as watching us from a distance, or probably not even watching us, maybe at best disinterestedly casting his eye across the creation every now and then, but he's dispassionate and uninterested, and everything has to be mediated to us through several layers. And when this ideology got into the church, then there was this idea that you had to suppress the physical realm, suppress your body, suppress even the physical aspects of the earth, and even ideas of going to heaven when you die, and the immortal soul leaving the body and escaping this tent and everything, which is totally unbiblical. In biblical language, it's all about resurrection in a physical body into the new creation. It's not about being detached from your body and going off to heaven. Well, that's Greek. And, when I often say nobody who's a believer in Jesus Christ is going to go to heaven when they die, people always go, what? And I say, show me in the Bible where that is. And there's not a single verse. And that's because Greek philosophical understandings have so infiltrated the church and Christian doctrine that most people think more like Greeks than they do like Jewish people when it comes to matters of life and death and resurrection and all that. And then that has ramifications for our ideas about righteousness.
And also related to like Platonism, one of Plato's big ideas was that, like what you're saying, that there's a more real reality somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that everything in the physical world that we see is like a shadow or a copy of the real thing somewhere else. And you can apply that to anything. You use the example of a table, or Plato uses one of his examples that he uses is beauty. He's like, we think that beauty can only be seen in something that's beautiful, but the enlightened philosopher can get in kind of touch with beauty itself, unattached from everything.
Yeah.
Like real beauty is this thing somewhere out there beyond space and time, up in the heavens or wherever. The ultimate beauty, and anything that we think is beautiful is just a poor borrowing from that.
Yeah.
And you can apply that to anything. The color blue,
Yeah.
a microphone, light, the table, it's all realer, borrowing from something more real somewhere else.
Yeah.
So, like I said, Socrates was, his student was Plato, and then Plato's student was Aristotle, and Plato and Aristotle in particular were right into this metaphysics meaning beyond physical, the out there beyond physical. And Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor.
Yeah.
So Alexander the Great conquered the known world with the Greek Empire, and then he had Aristotle as his tutor, and then Aristotelian Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy became widespread in the Greek Empire. Then the Romans took over, but they loved heaps of the Greek stuff, so they kept it, including philosophy.
Yeah.
So that's why it's called the Greco-Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So even in the time of the Roman Empire, Greek was still the dominant language in the empire.
And the dominant way of thinking.
And Greek philosophy was the dominant way of thinking.
Yeah.
And then when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Greco-Roman Empire, then you've got an empire that's filled with Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysical philosophy, then with an official religion of Christianity. And like you said, people like Augustine, who were philosophers before converting, and you get like Greek philosophy embedding its way in Christian thinking for centuries.
Yeah.
With this idea that there's a realer reality somewhere else that we borrow from.
I hear Christians say this all the time, that in everyone there's a divine spark, and that when you die, your soul will travel off to heaven, and all these ideas. They're not Christian, and they're not Jewish. They're Greek. Quite often people find themselves being absolutely amazed when they realise a lot of the things that they think are Christian are actually not. They're actually Greek. And of course, Christendom has a lot to do with this. Christendom is kind of a hybrid between Greek philosophy and Greek Hellenization and Christianity. And while there are some good elements in it, it's ultimately bound to fail because it's kind of oil and water. They just don't mix. It's a mess. It can't really ultimately stay together. And I think we're actually experiencing a lot of that coming apart of those two things right now, or have been now for probably well over 2 centuries, I guess. So, and there's some good things to come out of that, because of what it means is people are being forced to go back to Scripture and to see things as they originally were thought of, and how the people who wrote the Scriptures actually thought. They certainly didn't think, well, Paul certainly didn't, and the others who wrote it didn't think in Greek ways of thinking. They were thinking as Jews. And I always like to say to Christians, the best thing you can do to try to understand Scriptures is think like a Jew, not like a Greek. But you do think like a Greek. I think like a Greek. I was brought up with classically Western education, and Western education is built on the foundation of Greek philosophical understandings. So we're bound to think in a Greek ways.
And some of the things that seem Greek, in particularly some of Paul's letters, N.T. Wright's got a podcast on his Ask N.T. Wright Anything, where he talks about Platonism. And he answers some questions about how some of these things of, like, Paul talks about the flesh versus the spirit, that seem dualistic.
The word flesh, sarx, is in Paul's writing, is rarely refers to the physical body. It actually refers to a state of being, and it's to do with the state of sort of broken, sinful humanity and the way that they see the world and the way they react. And interestingly, one of the ways that the flesh reacts is by pushing down the physical things and suppressing the physical realm, and saying, if I can just control my body completely, then I'll become more spiritual. And in Colossians, he actually says, don't be taken captive by human philosophy and the basic principles of this world, but rather be captured by Christ, something like that. I'm just quoting very loosely there. But this idea of suppressing the body is actually the flesh itself. That's the flesh at work. It's unfortunately, a lot of people mistranslate the word sarx, flesh, as being the physical body. But Paul actually uses the word soma to talk about the physical body when he wants to differentiate between the fallen human state and the physical body. And he even talks about how we're going to be saved in bodies.
Yeah.
So in that same passage. So
he says you'll God will give life to you, even though you're dead in your flesh due to sins.
Yeah.
You're alive. You'll be given life through the Spirit because of righteousness, and God Himself will give life to your mortal bodies.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. And I think the word bodies there, when it says mortal bodies, is actually soma rather than sarx. Now, the word sarx is sometimes translated to mean physical body in other parts of the Bible, but that's not the way Paul does it. I think I did a calculation once. It's something like 95% of the time that Paul uses the word sarx, he's referring to a state of being and a perception of the world, a worldview, rather than to the physical body. So, for instance, in the medieval ages, people like Jerome and so on really praised people who damaged their body in order to become more spiritual. So there's one interesting account where he actually gives praise to a young woman who had been really beautiful, but she let her hair become really oily and matted, and she stank. I mean, she just stank. And he praised her for stinking. And it's kind of ironic, but he was giving her high status because she had let herself go. And in that way, she had showed herself to be truly spiritual. But I would argue that that was actually the flesh on full display. And it was just this misunderstanding that had come through Greek philosophical understandings of, metaphysics and physics and separating in the radical dualism, which then got into the church and this idea of escaping the physical realm, when Old Testament and New, salvation is about the restoration of the physical realm, and that the spirit and the flesh and I shouldn't use the word flesh there, but the spirit and material things are all one thing. They're all part of one big creation, that the spirit and angelic beings and human beings and the animals and trees and everything are all part of one big thing. You're not meant to divvy it all up into, high things and low things and to things that are, perfect and things that are imperfect, that kind of thing. But it's all meant to be part of one beautiful big creation of which we're a part. And so in the new world, those kind of distinctions and this kind of ideas of radical dualism will be completely abolished.
So then with this backdrop of Greek metaphysical thinking weaving its way through Christian philosophy and theology for centuries, you get to the Middle Ages, and a whole bit of stuff's happened by the Middle Ages. But the church in Europe, in Christendom, has become pretty corrupt. There's a lot of the papacy and bishops and cardinals, the whole hierarchy and stuff is more about money and power than it is about.
Not like now.
Yeah, as opposed to now. And one of the ways of making money for the church at the time was a thing called indulgences, and that was linked to a few other things. Basically, there was this system that developed, and we're not going to get into how the whole system developed, but just that it was there into the Middle Ages, where, so a lot of people think of heaven and hell in the Middle Ages. I think a lot of Catholics still have purgatory.
They certainly do.
Yeah, so you've got heaven.
Officially they don't, but unofficially it's still there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought officially they did still.
No, I think Vatican II, they changed their official stand on that.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but I think
because I've heard a lot of stuff from Catholics where they talk about purgatory.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that just hangs on.
Okay, so we've got heaven and hell, and in between is purgatory. Now, because you were in Christian Europe and baptized as a baby, then you're automatically going to be going to heaven, whereas all the heathens from like the barbarian nations were going to be going to hell, all the unbaptized, right? But in the middle was purgatory. And purgatory is where you go to get purged on the way to heaven. And this worked on a point system, basically, where you had to reach a certain... it's like, have you seen the show The Good Place?
Yeah.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
You only watched one episode, though,
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. That it's basically based on this idea of heaven and hell, but they call it the good place and the bad place.
Yeah. Actually, I've seen more than one. I've seen a couple. Yeah, and I got the basic concept, yeah.
But you get into either based on your total accrual of points.
Yeah.
So every single thing you did in life had either positive or negative points applied, and whatever the total sum was at the end, if it was positive, you went to the good place, and if it was negative, you went to the bad place. And
yeah.
And that's basically the system that was in place in the medieval Europe, except you didn't go to the bad place.
Yep.
You had to have a certain amount of good points from your life to go straight to heaven when you died as a disembodied soul. So that's where there's all this Platonic stuff. Well, that's part of where it is.
Yep.
If you, as a baptized Christian who were guaranteed heaven and not hell, if you didn't have enough points when you died, you had to go to purgatory to get purged until your soul was in a fit enough condition for heaven.
Yeah.
Now, there were people who went straight to heaven and had points left over called merit. So it was called merit, right, in this system. And they were the saints. So, and also the Pope, before he died, already had plenty of, he had extra merit as well. So the saints who went straight to heaven because they'd worked up heaps of points called merit, had merit to spare.
Yeah.
And the Pope also had merit to spare. He had plenty to get straight to heaven, not go to purgatory for 10,000 years or whatever. So if you wanted to buy some lesser time in purgatory, either for yourself or for a dead loved one, it's like you've got a family member who's died, you're pretty sure they're going to spend about 100,000 years in purgatory.
Yeah, I got one of those, yeah.
You could buy their time, and the way it worked was you could buy merit that the church was custodians over from the dead saints or the Pope, who had extra merit. So this is where this idea of something real existing somewhere else, right, that you can draw from.
Yeah, sure.
Like there's merit out there.
Yeah.
And the saints have it. But you can get it put in your account metaphysically.
Yeah.
If you pay.
The indulgences.
Indulgence, that's exactly what indulgences were.
Yeah. The thing is, I hate to be cynical about this, but I can't help myself because if you know a little bit about history, you'll know that the people who developed this didn't develop that idea theologically. They developed it because they needed the money.
Yeah.
So it just comes down to, hey, what would be a good way we could get money out of people? I know. We'll tell them they can buy merit.
Yeah.
And that's literally what happened.
I think at the time of Martin Luther, there was a cardinal that was going around. He took it even further, where he was saying not only could you buy extra merit, but if you bought these indulgences from him, you could have all your sins forgiven.
Yeah. What a deal.
And he wrote a certificate that your sins are forgiven.
It's like those people who...
It was only 6 months' wages.
Yeah. It's like those people who sell, land on the moon. You know, you can buy part of the moon. And I remember people were actually doing that at one point. Of course, you never get to go there. You'll never get to touch it. But people just give you a certificate saying you own part of the moon. Yeah. It's a little bit like that.
Yeah.
It's hard. I find it really difficult not to... If it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny, but it's not funny. It's ruined untold thousands of lives, this ideology. And it's still around today. It's amazing how many people, even right now, think that somehow you can buy righteousness that way. Yeah. So, yeah.
Or you could do, it wasn't just indulgences. There was also like specific acts that you could do to get extra points, right? Like a pilgrimage or giving to the poor.
Yeah.
Or, different kinds of things to boost your merit.
Yeah.
Or you could pay for it.
Yeah.
And it was in this setting, particularly the corruption of indulgences, intercepts Martin Luther. So if you've heard of Martin Luther's 95 Theses that he nailed to door of the church in Wittenberg, that was all about indulgences. There were 95 arguments against indulgences and how they're a scam, basically, which is one of the big things that set off the Reformation. But so in the backdrop of a scheme where you can get merit from somewhere else applied to you, in this case, dead saints or the Pope, by paying for them, this is a really oversimplification. But coming out of the Reformation, we get a different scheme that basically still works on the same principle of getting merit from somewhere else. Instead of, it's not dead saints, it's Jesus. Jesus has infinite merit because he perfectly obeyed God. So he has infinite merit. And instead of paying to get some of his, we believe, we trust in the
merit of Christ.
We trust in the efficacy of Christ's
blood on the cross.
Yeah, blood on the cross.
Yeah,
essentially. Yeah, we trust in, as I've heard a lot of modern preachers say, we have faith in the finished work of the cross. And then with that correct trust in the efficacy of the cross for our forgiveness, then we get Christ's righteousness credited to us.
Or even
basically his merit that he's got plenty of, which we can't get enough of. That's the point. This goes back to from our first episode of righteousness meaning moral perfection. You have to get a high enough grade. And of course, in the Middle Ages, there were some people that got that grade, obviously the saints. Most of the plebs couldn't. We've kind of adapted that now to be no one's righteous. No one can reach the grade at all. We're all doomed. How the heck are we going to get enough points to get into heaven?
Yeah, we're utterly depraved is the way a lot of Reform people put it, that there's nothing at all about us that's even slightly good. And so it's kind of, we're completely doomed. Yeah.
So this is, yes, it's an oversimplification, but to make sense of how probably a lot of people view this whole divine exchange thing, it really does come down to that merit scheme in the Middle Ages being adapted by the reformers to be, well, no, we don't get merit from saints, we get it from Jesus, and we don't get it by paying or doing particular activities to get extra. The activity that you do, and I would say, or even say this is an activity, is that you believe that Christ's work was sufficient to save us. And then you get enough of his spare merit applied to you, which is how the imputation of Christ's righteousness works. His merit gets credited to us.
And I've got to say, that's what I was taught, all through my younger years. And incidentally, all my younger years were the years before now.
Oh, okay.
Just thought I'd point that out. But anyway, it's, I lived on that stuff, and I got to say, I look at that and I think, how did I think that? It's not a biblical idea, and this idea of this kind of substance being applied to us, or even if you take it as in a kind of a spiritual way of Christ's merit being applied to us. That's not what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians. I'm quite certain of that.
It's definitely not what he's saying in Romans 4 either.
Or anywhere else for that matter. Because when we take the whole Bible into our view, we come to understand righteousness, as we said before, is an attributation. It's something that God does rather than something we obtain.
But that'll be for the next episode.
It will, yeah. But it's a fascinating thing, and it is good just to know some of the history, because no one lives in a vacuum. And I've got to say, we Westerners, the very fact that we even call ourselves Western automatically implies that we have been affected by Hellenization and Greek thinking. And it is disturbing how deeply it has embedded itself in the contemporary church in the West right now, and right across the world, to be perfectly honest. I've been to churches all over the world, and even in Asia, many churches believe very similar kind of things. So I think there's an instinctive spirituality which runs along the same train tracks as the Greek way of thinking, because many of Eastern ways of thinking, even though they're different in many ways, they still have this idea of the physical realm being bad and evil and corrupt, and that somehow you've got to transcend this and get up to into a different kind of a state, and there's a stairway to heaven. But when we read the scripture, there is no stairway to heaven. Jesus is the door. He is the way. That's it. And it's either you trust in him or show's over. Anyway, speaking of show's over, are we going to sort of wrap it up here?
Yeah, so this episode is more of a look into historically some of the factors that have led to this, what we believe is a false idea of the imputation of Christ's righteousness to the believer.
Yeah.
And in our next episode, we're going to talk kind of more plainly about what righteousness is in terms of who is a righteous person according to the Bible, and how is that defined?
Yeah. And I do have to say, we've only just really deliberately almost made a caricature of history here, because you simply don't have time to go into it all. It's a really dense, complex subject.
It can get really messy.
Yeah, it gets really messy. And I know that we're going to get some interesting comments from some of our Lutheran friends. I know that Luther was an amazing individual, and that some of his Heidelberg disputation stuff is incredible. It still holds water today. All we're saying is that some of the ideas that came out of that period, and even out of Luther's ideas, that no one's perfect, not even Luther, not even you and me. And so...
also more to the point is that ideas that have become popularized since the Reformation too are even distortions of ideas from that.
That's right. So even
distortions on distortions.
Yeah, that's right. Distortions after distortions. That's why we keep saying it's so important to get back into a biblical context, what the biblical writers meant and said. That's what we've got to get our head around. And if we do, I can say from my own personal experience that you can reformat your Western ways of thinking so that you don't think like that anymore. I find now I just don't think like that for the most part. And it's life-changing. And I hope that's what we're doing. All right. Well, goodbye for now.
All right. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.